Hey guys, Derek and Jason here. Before we get going today, we've gotten a ton of comments from y'all asking for different people to be covered, questions, comments about episodes. So we've set up a new email address. It's called lastdays@tmz.com.
Yeah, so if you have any comments, questions, suggestions about future episodes, please go ahead and send them on in. We'd love to address them as we get them. So without further ado, here's today's episode. On April 25th, 2002, Lisa Left Eye Lopes, the talented rapper and one-third of perhaps the most important R&B group of the 90s and early 2000s, TLC, was driving a rented Mitsubishi Montero SUV with 8 other passengers, including her brother, her sister, and some members of a little-known Atlanta band called Egypt. They were driving along a narrow road in La Ceiba, Honduras, a coastal town of about 200,000 people known for its tourism, nightlife, and beautiful beaches. She was in Honduras for a 30-day spiritual retreat at a nearby healing center. There's actually video footage from the drive because Lisa was filming a documentary. In it, you can see Lisa in the front driving, occasionally looking into the camera. She doesn't speak at all, and there's nothing really out of the ordinary about the video, aside from the fact that Lisa is clearly not wearing a seatbelt. 3 women are crammed in the back seat, and you can see a man behind them in the rear cabin of the SUV. Suddenly, the tranquil scene is interrupted when Lisa swerves to avoid an oncoming truck and then sharply jerks the wheel of the vehicle to the left to avoid an oncoming car. You can hear the screams of several people in the car before the video abruptly cuts off. It's the last known footage of Lisa alive. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Lisa Left Eye Lopes.
We now know that after the video cuts off, the SUV Lisa was driving careened off the road, rolled several times, and then struck 2 trees before finally coming to rest in a ditch. Lisa and 3 other passengers were ejected from the vehicle, but miraculously, all 8 of her passengers survived with only minor injuries. The accident, however, killed Lisa instantly. An autopsy was performed at the relatively large city of San Pedro Sula, and the doctor determined that Lopes died of a fracture at the base of the cranium and suffered open cerebral trauma. Her funeral was held in her hometown of Lithonia, Georgia on May the 2nd and was attended by thousands. Her grave is engraved with the lyrics of her portion of the TLC hit Waterfalls, which you just heard at the top of the podcast, reading, quote, "Dreams are hopeless aspirations in hopes of coming true. Believe in yourself. The rest is up to me and you."
So news of Lopes' sudden and tragic death, she was just 30 years old at the time, immediately spread like wildfire. And the response to her passing showed just how impactful her short life had been, but also hinted at how complicated her legacy was going to be. So Jermaine Dupri, who worked with her, he's a big producer in Atlanta, said she was a true rock star. She didn't care about no press. She was the rock star out of the group. She was the one that would curse on TV. She had the tattoos. You could expect the unexpected. When you see Lisa, you could expect something from her. That's the gift she carried.
There's so much in Jermaine Dupri's quote here. We're going to talk about it at length here, but so much complication about her. She was so talented,
Yes.
but she was also at the center of a ton of storms. And I think that you hear that in Jermaine Dupri's quote.
You can hear it packed into his comment, right? When you call someone a rock star, it's complicated. It's not just a warm feeling necessarily. Right. It's that she had layers to her and she really lived life.
Right.
L.A. Reid struck a more, he was the guy who actually signed TLC. He's a legend unto himself. He signed TLC to his LaFace label in the 90s. He struck a more sort of paternal tone and just commented on the loss of such a young and talented star. He said, "No words can possibly express the loss and sadness I feel for this most devastating loss." And of course, everyone looked to her former bandmates, TLC. Tion T-Boz Watkins and Rosanda Chili Thomas, the surviving members of TLC, mourned the loss of Lisa, but their comment was very simple at the time. What they said is, "We have truly lost our sister. We'll always be a group. Lisa will never be replaced."
Devastating. When I would talk about her, I was speaking like she was still here. You know, I couldn't speak about her like in past tense. I couldn't do it. It's always going to be a sore spot for us because that was our sister.
From the time she was plucked from obscurity before turning 20 all the way up until her death a decade later, Lisa Left Eye Lopes led a rock star life. She accomplished more in those 10 years than most artists in a lifetime, But her life was constantly marred by scandal and brushes with the law, stormy friendships, messy and sometimes violent romantic relationships. All of it was part of Lisa's life. Lopes was born in Philadelphia in 1971. Her mother was a seamstress, and her father was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army. Her childhood was strictly regimented, and Lopes found her outlet in music and played multiple instruments, including the piano, clarinet, saxophone. At the age of 10, she formed a musical group with her two younger siblings called the Lopes Kids and performed gospel songs at churches and local events.
You can sort of see the collision even early in her life. When you read stories about Lisa Left Eye, you hear about her father a lot, who was this staff sergeant, and he was very strict disciplinarian. But Lisa was always sort of brash, this creative soul that was yearning to burst out and was tightly confined within these restrictions. And it paints a picture of the type of person she became in later life, where she was just...
This is it's such a common theme, both in real life and in fiction, where you have the artist competing against the person who's trying to restrain the artist and make them live a more square and quote-unquote normal life.
And some of the best creativity can be forged in that kind of conflict.
It really is.
And she's definitely true to that case. In 1990... she moves to Atlanta, which at the time, the early 90s, Atlanta is starting to develop into this thriving musical scene. Obviously, now it's fully arrived. We've had, waves of hip-hop with Outkast and so forth, but it was really nascent at this point. She initially joins a female trio called Second Nature, and in that trio is T-Boz and a woman named Crystal Jones. Crystal, and that's going to be important. The band was renamed to TLC from Second Nature to match the names of each member. You had T-Boz, you had Lisa, and you had Crystal. But it never really found its footing in this orientation. So they ended up swapping Crystal out with a woman named Rosanda Thomas. Now, you see a problem there. There's no C in her name. Right. So she had to be given a C name, and that happened in a funny sort of way.
Yeah, so Lopes bestows the name Chili on Rosanda Thomas because they wanted to keep this TLC name. If you're wondering, T-Boz is just slang for Tian being the boss, and Left Eye is said to have come from a compliment, I guess, that she once received from a New Edition member, Michael Bivins.
From Michael Bivins, from New Edition.
The New Edition member, the most famous one, who apparently told Lopes he was attracted to her because her left eye had an interesting and distinct shape that was different than her right eye, and she kind of leaned into that by accentuating the left eye, sometimes covering the right lens of her glasses with a condom is the story that's out there.
She would promote sort of safe sex, or she would cover it with an eye patch, and she would
which leans into the waterfalls kind of safe sex mantra and the whole thing.
I love this story though, because you can see Michael Bivins is sort of a legendary sort of musician himself, but you can see that he was kind of spitting game. He was sort of saying, "Girl, you're beautiful in the most unique way." And Lisa Left Eye, when you look at pictures of her, she was gorgeous. I mean, there's no two ways about it, but also had this very unique sort of face, and her eyes are a little bit different.
That your two eyes are different that can cut the wrong way, out of the wrong hands. Michael Bivins able to pull it off. You and I might have failed.
Exactly. I've been like, girl, those are irregular. But anyway, it went well for her, and it became her name. TLC isn't one of those bands that sort of slowly developed a following. They burst onto the scene. The group, in their debut album, which is Ooh on the TLC Tip, sold 6 million copies, delivered 4 hit singles, including the jam What About Your Friends, that sort of really defined that early sound, which was a blend of hip hop and smooth R&B. So from the very beginning, Jason, it's really obvious that the band works together seamlessly. They sound very good as a group, but Lisa is kind of the breakout star. And what I'm saying is most of the songs would begin with some version of T-Boz's sort of smooth baritone vocals. You'd get this chorus with Chili, which she had this sort of swooning, lilting voice. But the songs would all lead to this fiery explosion where Lisa would take the mic and throw in this catchy rap verse. She had this distinct cadence, this high-pitched voice, and that invariably in most of their songs became sort of the most indelible part.
Yeah, speaking of fiery explosions, while they were achieving a lot of professional success, Lisa's private life was a bit rockier. She famously dated Atlanta Falcons superstar wide receiver Andre Rison in the early 1990s, but the relationship was extremely volatile, to say the least. Risen he was charged with aggravated assault in September of 1993 after a late night incident in which Lisa accused him of beating her inside of a grocery store and then firing a warning shot at a wall outside of a store after two men tried to step in and, I guess, protect her. Risen claims he was defending himself. And, of course, there's this famous incident.
Rap singer Lisa Lopes is free on bond today after being charged in connection with a fire at the home of her boyfriend, Atlanta Falcons wide receiver Andre Rison.
Lisa burned the house down.
Yeah, so that's in June of 94. She was, I guess, drinking heavily. The reports at the time, she was drinking quite heavily at the time, may have had a real problem with alcohol. She allegedly, this is all sort of the stories that came out, and there's two sides. We'll discuss that. She confronted Andre Rison after she claimed she caught him in bed with another woman. After a nasty fight, Rison left the home, and Lopes took some of his very expensive shoes and threw them into the bathtub along with some teddy bear that he had bought for her. Yeah. And she lit them on fire, not realizing that he had recently replaced the typical porcelain marble tub with something made out of fiberglass, which is
a
flammable.
Yeah.
So in any event, so the whole thing goes up in flames, ended up consuming the entire house. And although Rison had admitted that there was some physical altercations between the two. He didn't claim that he was completely innocent in this entire thing. But he did ultimately claim that in this instance, he really hadn't done anything wrong.
I didn't do anything wrong, and God is my witness. Only thing I did that he might say that I did wrong, and that was I slapped her after I had been hit about 50 times to try to calm her down, and that's why I went on a 20-mile walk.
So she has a different take on this thing. You can hear what she says happened.
So I picked up the pipe, one swing, crack, bashed the windshield in Andre's Mercedes. One swing, crack, bashed the windshield in his other car. Dang. One crack. Get back up, went back to the other one. Man. But we're in the middle of doing all of this stuff. It's like we all stopped at once in unison. It's like we all stopped what we was doing and we looked up. This black smoke just rolling from under the...
So regardless of whose side you take, this was not a healthy relationship. And I remember it was followed very closely, and it gives you an indication. These were two people in their 20s. You know, Andre Rison's a little bit older than Lisa Left Eye, but they were really going through it. They had a very volatile relationship.
And also for people who aren't big NFL fans, Andre Rison was a superstar, Jerry Rice or Randy Moss, some other names you might know at the time. He was a huge deal. And so the two of them, they were a real sort of Hollywood celebrity power couple, both based in Atlanta.
Absolutely.
And so this was a big news story when all this happened.
Absolutely. So Lisa ended up getting charged with first-degree arson. She was eventually given a sentence of 5 years of probation, $10,000 fine. Remarkably, the coda to all this is that in the years that followed, the couple actually reconciled. Yeah. Andre Rison and Lisa Left Eye, after the house burning, would date again on and off for years until the end of her life. He wasn't her boyfriend at the time of her death, but they really did have this on and off again thing for the rest of the time. It didn't just end there. So, you know, boyfriend drama aside, the band really started to skyrocket from this point. Their follow-up album, Crazy Sexy Cool, is quite simply one of the most commercially successful, critically acclaimed albums in hip-hop history. It has sold 23 million copies. It spent 2 years on the Billboard 200, and it became the first album from an all-girl group in history to attain diamond status. So you're really getting a sense. This is an all-girl group that followed the Supremes, followed big names, and they're the first to attain diamond status, which is selling 10 million of an album. And they did it twice, 2 times diamond status. It even cracks Rolling Stones magazine's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. So it's no surprise, really. The album has tracks penned by Jermaine Dupri, Babyface, Dallas Austin, and even Prince. And today, it still stands out as this sort of edgy, experimental, but thoroughly pop album that always has catchy hooks, yet really pushed R&B and hip hop in a new direction. So no podcast that even brings up TLC at all would be complete without discussing their most enduring song and the single biggest piece of their legacy, which is the song Waterfalls, which we opened this podcast with. It just so happened to be penned in part by Left Eye, and it gives you a sense that she was not just the sort of person doing a rap verse on the song. She was very, very talented and wrote a lot of their hits, including this one.
Dreams are hopeless aspirations and hopes are coming true. Believe in yourself, the rest is up to me and you.
God, that song brings me back.
It's so good. You can do every lyric,
It's
right?
of a time, but it was such a huge song. It was one of those songs, sort of like almost Old Town Road, where the whole world was obsessed with it for a series of months, right?
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
It's one of those, it comes on the radio, you still play it, you
Yes.
still just somehow know all of it. So
Yeah.
the women after that, look, their legacy was complete, but they released their third album, Fan Mail, in 1999. That sells 14 million copies and truly sort of cements their status at the top of the heap in the busy Atlanta music scene. If you're a fan of sort of No Scrubs, this is the album for you.
Despite the commercial success the women were enjoying, there were signs of trouble within the group. Left Eye was starting to chafe at her role, feeling that she was being underutilized and pigeonholed into the quote-unquote rapper of the trio, while the rest of the vocals went to T-Boz and Chili. The women did start to quibble, Derek, in the media, with Lopes grousing to Vibe magazine that she could no longer stand behind TLC as a representation of her musical tastes. For their part, T-Boz and Chili fired back that Lopes was selfish, telling Entertainment Weekly that Left Eye is only concerned with Left Eye. And based on what sort of you see, I think there's points on both sides. She was maybe an underutilized, really gifted person, but I think she was also a very difficult bandmate. And it seems that that's
Sometimes
true from the
great talent
comments.
comes with a difficult personality.
Yeah,
and she was
right.
certainly in that category.
This back and forth culminates with Left Eye laying down a challenge to the three women release a three CD set, sort of a competition. They would each have the primary role of a solo album for each one of them, and then there would be a prize given of $1.5 million to the winner. T-Boz and Chili didn't take the bait, and they called out Lopes, saying this was selfish, evil, heartless, and there's something to that, right? You theoretically have a band of three women, and she's seeking, well, let's see who the best of us is. And
she wanted a
win.
public competition.
Yeah.
This is like John Lennon telling the Beatles, let's each release our own solo albums, and we'll see how good Ringo does.
By the way,
And
well, it's unfair to Ringo would have lost that, but it's actually something John Lennon would have done had he thought of it, right?
Yeah.
Sort of that
It's sort
vitriol
of
was
genius.
percolating up, right?
And her confidence in her own abilities to win a competition like that.
I guess they never officially broke up, but Lisa does drop a solo album in 2001. It sold reasonably well, even at a top 20 hit in the UK, and a posthumous duet with Tupac.
Outlaws rushing, busting, we untouchable.
I know you feel me, it's untouchable. Make yourself presentable.
So it's at this juncture that we can say that Lisa's life, she was a legend of TLC, and they were already had that status at the time, but her life was sort of tumultuous, and she was at this inflection point where her solo career wasn't taking the same course that she thought it would take. And her temperament seemed to exacerbate problems in her life. You could see it with the problems she had with her bandmates and so forth. So this factored into how she'd spend what would become the final months of her life. After all the turbulence of her relationships, including with Andre Rison, with her bandmates, she became very interested in just slowing down. She picked up an interest in numerology, yoga, new age healing techniques that were targeted at spiritual rejuvenation. Although she was just 30 years old, and I keep emphasizing that because her entire public life was from 20 to 30, and she just crammed it all in. She had all this drama, so it sounded like she was at this stage where she wanted to focus on shoring up her mental and spiritual health and begin this sort of new chapter in her life.
And this is what takes her to Honduras, to a spiritual retreat run by a man named Dr. Sebi, who ran the Usha Village Healing Center. Dr. Sebi, whose real name was Alfredo Bowman, was a colorful and really controversial character in the medical community. Most reports suggest that he was not an actual doctor, and he propagated some really unorthodox views about modern medicine, such as his belief that he could cure AIDS with traditional holistic medicines sourced from Africa. Though largely a lot of what he did involved purging and cleaning the body with natural herbs. I mean, there are beneficial elements to purging and to detoxing. It's very in vogue right now. But obviously, there are some substantial risks when you are depriving the human body of all of the nutrients and all the good and bad bacteria that your body relies upon. And when you're really purging this stuff, it can have some really detrimental impacts on the body. And, it's got to be done carefully and under real supervision. And
Jason's sort of being careful, but this is a figure who's kind of a charlatan.
He's a snake oil salesman,
yes,
right?
and you can
He
see...
doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not a licensed physician, thinks he's picked up on his own, and then he begins to proselytize And certain people who are maybe susceptible to this kind of thing buy in, and Lisa Left Eye Lopes being one of them.
Yeah, remember, she's a young person, so she's susceptible to vulnerabilities of this type. She's also a successful person. You can see someone like this maybe thinking they can leverage their practice and gain more fame by attaching themselves to someone like Lisa, and she was a true believer. She visited the Usha Healing Center on a number of occasions during the 5 years before her death. Her publicist said she loved Honduras and even considered relocating there permanently to escape the pressures of stardom and hope to perhaps develop a clothing line, write a book about her life. This is a person who was clearly enamored with what Dr. Sebi had to offer, all of his healing techniques. And so there was some speculation at the time of her death that his methods may have impaired her driving abilities at the time of the crash. If you watch the video closely, she does seem to be sort of strangely serene and maybe even a bit out of it. As I said, she's not speaking. You can look this up on YouTube. She's just sort of gazing and has a vacant expression. It's important to note, however, that there's no conclusive link to any of the healing treatments she got at the center and the cause of the car accident.
Yeah.
The primary culprit at the end of the day is that she was not wearing a seatbelt. She was ejected from the car and her cranium and suffered that brutal head injury, and that's what killed her.
Yeah, it's interesting to see her. I mean, they are filming this whole thing. Whenever a camera's on you, you're always going to be performing to some degree. So it's hard to look at her and say, there's some speculation she may have been high at the time. She may have been starving at the time. She's purging and not eating. Who knows? But she also may have just been sort of trying to look kind of
spiritual introspectively and introspective.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And that may explain kind of that look that she had in her face. We just don't know. We never will know. And even though treatments at Usha didn't necessarily cause the accident, this was not entirely placid and uneventful retreat. There are two significant events during the trip that may have had a huge impact on her mental state. First, 3 weeks before the fatal accident, she was actually involved in another car accident that killed a 10-year-old. She wasn't driving. She was a passenger at the time, but it was her personal assistant was driving, and it struck the young child. The singer ended up paying about $3,700 for the child's medical and funeral expenses and gave the boy's family a little less than $1,000, and the accident was never reported to the police. Very sort of Honduran and sort of the treatment of this. She sort of paid what I'm sure to the family was
enormous
a huge,
amount of money.
an enormous sum, but it gets swept under the rug. It never really gets reported. But for her death, it probably wouldn't have come out. Second, perhaps haunted by the fatal crash that killed the young boy, Lisa had been plagued by nightmares and visions in the days leading up to her death, and even posted a video about these premonitions shortly before her car accident.
That I had a real frightening dream last night. I dreamed that I woke up and I looked at the sun, and it was like a fourth of the size of the earth. That's how big it was. Oh man, trying to figure out what the rest of the dream was. Anyway, it was basically the end.
So we've got these nightmares that are weighing on her. We've got the death of this young boy, obviously, that is weighing on her. It's hard to know how they played into her overall state of mind or what impact they may have had on the crash. But nevertheless, these are factors that were certainly present in her mind at the time of her own death.
Yeah, there's a nagging sort of sense, and you're right. When you look at this, there's maybe a performative element, but at the end of the day, she's on a sort of rural type road. She swerves to avoid an oncoming car, and she suffers a fatal injury from a car accident, and that's really where we are. But I want to move to what could have become of Lisa, because as I've emphasized throughout this episode, she was very young, 20 to 30. And to guys you and our age, that just seems very young.
She's got all the world in front of her.
The world's in front of her, even though she had lived and had such a bright career and her solo career hadn't gone in the direction. What do you think was sort of coming for Lisa specifically? And in terms of the band never really broke up. Could they have come back together? Where were things leading?
I think the band may have run its course. I mean, we see, when people get into their 50s and 60s, they begin to become more, think more idyllically about their past life. They may have come back together, but I just think it's all
that
the
moment
facts.
in music.
She was really talented, and she was only 30. I know that her solo career hadn't taken off yet, but she was still lined up with people like Tupac. She was still affiliated with the biggest names in music. I just have to think that, if she wanted it, and maybe that she would have decided to live her life in Honduras, and being very content with a new, more mature Lisa. But had she decided to stay in music, I think it's almost certain that she would have had some success. Maybe not quite what she had. It's hard to imagine that, but certainly something.
Yeah, look, I mean, we have some evidence that she was a very talented producer. So even if she was no longer the star talent, she, did a record deal with this R&B group Black, which had a platinum-selling single, 808. Some people have heard those songs as well. She hosted a show called The Cut and launched the career of Anastasia, who ended up having her own multi-platinum career. So this is someone who could discover talent, spot it, produce songs that were hits not just for her. I have another take on where Lisa was heading because she had this very rare presence and charisma, and I think she was going to become an actress because I think she had this sort of stunning look to her, sort of undefinable, the left eye sort of mystique about her. She has just one cameo that I could find in House Party 3, the third installment of the Kid and Play movies, and even in this brief scene, you can see just sort of charisma jumping off the screen.
Even.
Hold up. See, y'all niggas ain't even gonna play us like that. Y'all know we roll like filet mignon, and y'all trying to play us out like some soybean burgers? Bruh, we have better things to do. Sex as a weapon. Yes, we're ready to do business.
I love it because she's sort of like hamming it up, but there's some people who, even in a throwaway movie like that, and that's by the time you're on the third installment of House Party, it's not a very good film.
It's a money grab for Kid and Play.
But she's got something, and I think she could have sort of harnessed that and done something in acting. So, look, Lisa Left Eye Lopes, her legacy is very, very complicated, as we've alluded to in this episode, but there's no doubt that she's one of the most influential figures in hip-hop. She just is. She's a trailblazing female voice that paved the way for the futures of sort of brash, outspoken artists. You've got Nicki Minaj and Cardi B. Those kind of artists owe a debt to Lisa Left Eye Lopes. And even though they had a rocky history, T-Boz reflected on the impact of the loss of Lisa and how she hoped to preserve her legacy and her placement in music and pop culture history. And it really seems only fitting to give her the final word here.
So I was depressed probably about 2 years. That was my creative partner, and she was family. She really became my cousin too, because my uncle's married to her mom to this day, but I just couldn't deal. Because I want to remember that we built something great together and keep that going for her, because that was my promise to her, and that's what we started together, even before I met Chili.